Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Burdick, and I'm going to briefly start us off with an overview about VE Cross, really the basics. A lot of this is going to will harko back or echo what Jane Allen did on Tuesday, but just in case anybody wasn't able to attend her amazing training, I think it's really important that we all just get some of the foundational aspects of VE Cross. So I'm going to start a PowerPoint now. For any of you who were on my training last week, you know that I struggle with this for some reason. So if you don't see my PowerPoint, please speak up because it's here. All right. There we go. So
we can see it, Jen. You're good.
Perfect. So first, just, there's always, for an adult case, there's going to be 5 steps in this sequential evaluation. The first one is someone doing substantial gainful activity? Do they have severe impairments? Do they meet a listings, past relevant work? And step 5 is there any other work they can do in the national economy? When we're talking about VE Cross and everything related to that, we're really focusing on steps 4 and 5. Now, the role of the vocational expert at your hearings is to do a few things. They're supposed to provide impartial expert opinions about jobs that your claimant held during the last 15 years. The judge will describe those jobs to the vocational expert, and they are supposed to classify them in the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, and they're supposed to, in response to a hypothetical based on your claimant, are supposed to describe what their abilities are from a vocational standpoint today. I put this in finger quotes because this is all based on a book that was published in 1992. So another private practitioner, I think, has described this well as like, this is all fiction, this is all a game, but it's a game you need to play, and it's a game that if you win, you can help your client get benefits. So I say that because vocational experts in hearings are going to say your clients can do all sorts of random jobs that don't even really exist. For example, there's even research to say that a very favorite job called being a surveillance monitor literally doesn't exist anymore. They will talk about, oh, this person might be able to, I got one job that was basically about microfiche. Nobody has microfiche anymore. Everything's on a computer. As I said, this is all kind of fiction, but it's fiction you need to understand because it can be determinative to the case. It's because the ALJ has to know if your client's medical impairments would limit their ability to going back to past employment, or would allow them to do other jobs in the economy. And this DOT, this book from 1992 is what they're allowed to look at to make that determination. So just briefly, I know Jane talked about this, but past relevant work, what is that? That is work that your claimant did in the past 15 years. So that full 15 years. However, it has to be substantial gainful employment, and it must have lasted long enough to gain skills needed to perform the job. So this is really important. And just as a basic thing, a lot of our clients probably have done small bits of work from time to time. If somebody has worked for a temp agency and lasted at those positions for a matter of days or a week or two, that is probably not substantial gainful employment. If it's not full-time, it's probably not substantial gainful employment. And you should point that out to the judge because everyone wants to skip 4 if it's plausible and it makes sense to. So those are just some, I think, we're happy to go into more details as people get more into the practice when it comes to step 4 and past work. But just generally, if your client has part-time work, in general, light bulbs should be flashing that that's probably not substantial gainful employment, and like little tiny work attempts also don't count. And then at step 5, any other jobs in the national economy, again, these are jobs based on the DOT. The vocational expert is often the one that's going to be asked to produce, different job titles to indicate whether the hypothetical person based on your claimant could do this work or adjust to work. And if they cannot, that it's going to be very hard for your judge not to grant a favorable decision. So at step 5, what's important is the burden shifts from us to the commissioner. That's why we need the VE, right? The burden shifts to the commissioner to establish, if you can't go back to past work, that there's other work in the economy that they can do. And there's only 2 ways the commissioner can establish that. They can either use the grids, which I'm not going to address, though I know Jane addressed earlier this week, or they can go to the vocational expert to come up with jobs. So I point this out because this is the game, right? When you get to step 5, the game is, can Social Security prove that there's other jobs your claimant can do? And to the extent that you can neutralize the VE's testimony, you can make it so even if the judge doesn't want to pay your client, that they have to, right? Because they don't have proof that they could do other work. So in my head, I break up like VE cross really into 3 separate categories. The first, part 1, is the RFC, or the hypotheticals that the administrative law judge presents to the vocational expert about your claimant, right? I think this is a really important part of it, and I'm going to spend some time here because I think part 1 is where the judge really communicates with you as an attorney about what he thinks about your case, right? And that's going to give you a lot of information that I think is important to figuring out how you are going to respond to that. The second is the cross. And I'm going to propose here that there's 3 questions that you should pretty much ask every single time you do VE cross, even if you don't ask any other questions. And then part 3 would be whether you're going to do additional cross. And there's a bunch of different types of crosses that you can do. And a lot of those are ones that we're going to work with you at during the breakout sessions today. So the breakout sessions are kind of part 3. So the residual functional capacity. So this is the ALJ's hypothetical where they're supposed to put together a hypothetical that represents the most your client can do in this hypothetical setting. This usually addresses their age and their education, whether they have any environmental limitations. Like, for example, you know, I have a lot of clients who have asthma. If they have asthma, then they're going to usually include some limits as far as what sort of environment they can work on, whether it can be hot or cold, or whether there's a certain amount of debris in the air. They usually provide some exertional limits that'll be like how much they can lift and carry. You know, are we talking 50 or more? So that's medium work. Are we talking about heavy work, 100 and more if there's not limits? Or are they limited to 20 pounds and under? Then we're talking about light or sedentary. And then there's usually non-exertional limitations, which would be any limitations on the ability to understand, remember, concentrate, interact, hear, see, any postural limitations. Now, if you haven't had a hearing before, and you know, I know that the skill level among you guys probably varies. You know, one of my first tips is you want to write down as much as you can about what the ALJ is saying to the VE. And some of the things you want to look out for specifically are, first of all, like, what are the limits on lifting and carrying? Because you want to know if he's directing or she's directing the vocational expert to give you jobs in the light category, the medium category, or the heavy category, or if it's sedentary. Because depending where you are, you're going to know whether or not you're going to be able to knock out jobs with cross. Additionally, you know, are they including other physical limits that are important? You know, one is bending and stooping, which can be very important. And I think Rebecca's going to talk more about that in her hypo later. Another is if there's any limitations with fingering or handling, which can be pretty significant when it comes to eroding, like what jobs are out there. Bilateral hand movements. Another thing that can be significant, if there's any limits with the cervical spine. Even if you're doing sedentary work, if you can't move your neck much, you can't do much work. So these are things to be listening to. Other things, you know, I talked about how the judge will give you limits about non-exertional limitations. A very common one is simple routine tasks. In that phrase, what the judge is communicating is that they are potentially giving you a limit based on concentration, but also maybe understanding with simple routine tasks. You know, that is a phrase that has been heavily litigated and can mean a lot of things or not mean a lot of things, but a lot of judges use that to say, this client is only able to do, you know, kind of low skilled work that doesn't require too many questions and is going to be pretty routine, not a lot of learning new tasks all the time. Another phrase that is pretty common is production-paced jobs or no production-paced jobs. That usually speaks to concentration limits. And they often will include limitations to how often people can interact with the public, coworkers, or supervisors. So these are all things I would say that, while the judge is handing these out, you want to listen for those things and write them down. Another thing that is worth noting is whether the judge will limit the vocational expert to SVP 1 or 2 jobs. I know Jane talked a lot about the different ways they classify jobs in the DOT. This is one I hear judges say a lot, and it refers to the specific vocational preparation. What SVP 1 and 2 refer to typically is unskilled work, right? So if the judge is limiting your client to unskilled work, that means to a certain extent, they're crediting allegations about trouble with understanding or concentration or stress or anxiety and building it in to a certain extent. GED limitations usually have to do with education, and you also will want to write down and understand if the judge says anything about doing things occasionally or frequently. And just in case anyone doesn't know what those mean, they don't mean what they mean in real life. Occasionally means someone doing something up to 1/3 of the workday, and frequently is 2/3 of the workday. So occasionally isn't that occasional, but that is, important things to note when the judge is giving their questions to the VE. And one of the things you want to think about when the judge is providing this RFC is anything missing? Did they forget to include any limitations about concentration? Maybe the judge didn't say simple routine tasks, even though you brought evidence that your client, graduated from high school but had an IEP and maybe has an IQ in the 70s and has issues with understanding and concentration. Start thinking in your head if anything's missing. So after that happens, the judge will offer several hypotheticals to claimants. Usually 3, sometimes 6. That will usually be slight variations on that one RFC. They'll usually add a little bit more. And the vocational expert will respond one of 2 ways. They're going to say either, based on this hypothetical question, there are jobs this person could do, or there are not jobs. And if there are jobs, the vocational expert will usually give you a job name, a DOT number, and tell you how many of these jobs exist in the economy. So a VE is not supposed to provide their own evaluation, the medical evidence, whether your client should be going to vocational rehab, whether you can compete with unimpaired individuals. The VE's testimony is supposed to be pretty sparse, really just jobs, no jobs. And another tip is you always want to write down those DOT code numbers that the VE gives, because I know Jane pointed this out in her presentation on Tuesday, but I can also, testify that it is not uncommon for the VEs to give you DOTs that just do not exist, right? They just give jobs that you look up when you go home and you're like, this is not what you said it was. You said this person was a feather shaper, and this has to do with table sorting, and this just wasn't proper testimony. And it's a good thing to note, because sometimes you can actually knock out all of the VE testimony because it was just fabricated, or they just gave you improper numbers. I don't know why that happens. I just know that it has happened enough that it is worth noting. So part 2, what do you do? So the VE probably responded that there were jobs to some of these hypotheticals. If the VE said no jobs to every hypothetical the judge gave you, the only question I want you to ask is question 1 here, and then I want you to just say no more questions and get out of here, because then the VE has basically said that they can't find work for your client and you've won. Otherwise, in almost every case, there's these next 3 questions that I think you should do. The first one, which is super important, is your testimony limited to the specific questions asked by the ALJ? It's very important. It's very important, particularly for appeal, because often if the ALJ's RFC wasn't proper, if they missed something, if it didn't accommodate one of your client's impairments, one of the arguments you'll make on appeal is the ALJ's RFC wasn't good, so the VE's testimony, the VE wasn't able to give jobs that were actually comprehensive to something that resembled your client, so they need to remand it. And what SSA will say, or the Office of General Counsel, if you were in federal district court, is like, yeah, that was wrong, but the VE was there the whole time. They heard everything. So the VE probably considered it. It's kind of a ridiculous argument, but it's also very easy to make sure it doesn't happen. And all you need to do is ask that one question to eliminate that problem on appeal. So it creates a really nice appeal issue if you can just limit the VE's testimony to exactly what was in the ALJ's question. And you should do that every time. Now, the other two questions you really need to ask, or at least make sure the ALJ asked. So either you need to ask it, or you can skip it if the judge asked it, but they didn't, you should definitely ask, is if someone were to miss at least 3 days of work a month, would that be inconsistent with competitive substantial gainful employment? This is getting at days absent. You don't have to ask 3 days. I typically do if I don't know the VE. So almost all VEs will testify that if someone is going to miss 3 or more days a month, that they're not going to be able to hold a job. A few VEs I know will say 2 days or even 1 day a month is enough not to hold a job, but I've never heard a VE say that you can miss 3 or more days a month and still maintain employment. So it's a good question to ask, because even if the VE said that there were jobs to every single hypothetical that your judge asked, if you introduce this in the record, you're giving the judge a way to pay your case. You're saying, hey, I did ask these hypotheticals, but the more I think about it, the evidence really does show that this person would have trouble with attendance and as a result would not be able to maintain employment. So I kind of drafted this in a leading way. I think it is helpful to ask this in a leading way, because sometimes vocational experts will ramble if you give them the opportunity to say anything more than yes or no. But this is a question that I think in almost every case you should always be asking. So in some cases, the ALJ will ask it, and if the ALJ has already asked it, you don't need to be redundant. The third magic question addresses time off task. Very similar to days absent. This is, most VEs will testify that if someone was off task 20% of the day outside of standard breaks, that they would not be able to maintain competitive employment. So again, VEs vary on how much time off task is required to make someone unemployable. Some will go as low as 10, some need to have 15 or 20%. If you don't know where your VE lands, I would ask 20%. But again, this is a really important question to get in the record, particularly if all the other testimony the VE is given has said that there are jobs. This will give you an opportunity, or the judge an opportunity, or a path to potentially pay the case if the VE is just asking has given lots of jobs and satisfied the burden. Now, again, you could stop earlier, but at this point, if the VE is offered only favorable testimony to your client, you don't want to ask more questions. That's plenty. Go ahead and say that you're done. But in a lot of cases, the VE will have said that there are jobs to everything. And so in this case, I will first say that you are probably already losing. So you should feel pretty comfortable going after the VE on cross, because it's more like you're taking a chance at trying to win this case. You're probably not going to mess it up. So the third part is more advanced VE cross. So there's a couple different things you can do here. One is I always prepare an alternative hypo based on the facts. I don't always ask it to the VE, but I think it's really helpful to prepare it so that I know, what would the evidence provide me that would create a circumstance where my client would win. So a really good source of evidence here is if you have any MSS forms in the file, so any source statements, that these are often included in the A section with evaluators from the BDD. Sometimes you'll get them in CE reports. If you have any that are pretty favorable, sometimes it is helpful to like literally go through each one with the VE and ask if someone who has the limitations that are listed in that report would be able to work, particularly if you have some that you think would get an answer of no. And if you have several different medical opinions that would suggest that your client has, you know, pretty severe functional limitations that would prevent them from working, you want to do each one separately. So if the judge decides to give great weight to whoever, or what give weight to whichever doctor, if their corresponding opinion would result in no jobs, it makes it easy for the judge to write a favorable opinion. And then you might want to consider if you can ask specific questions to undermine the jobs offered by the VE. This is, you'll usually know this when you see it. Like sometimes, you know, for example, I was in a case once where one of the issues was that the client had pretty limited visual abilities, and yet the VE gave a whole bunch of jobs, one of them being someone who screws in lenses and glasses that require you to deal with tiny things. And you can just start asking some very basic questions like, well, could somebody who has, you know, very limited vision, like do this job? And they'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, I wasn't thinking about that kind of thing. So sometimes VEs will offer jobs that just blatantly don't make sense based on the facts of the case. And so in that case, you might want to undermine specific jobs. But that only makes sense if you can really knock out all of the jobs. So these are just like the basics. The main thing I'd like you to take away from this is, if nothing else, you want to be pretty attentive when the ALJ is giving the RFC to understanding what limits they are asking the VE to accommodate when coming up with jobs. And you're going to want to take down the DOT numbers of the jobs given. And then you need to ask those 3 questions. If you just do that, you know, I feel like you've done something, like you have represented your client. Now we're going to start talking about more advanced crosses that I think are kind of like level 2 in the breakout. And I think we're going to go through right now and talk about each one specifically so you have some sense of it. But I will send this out after this training, just so you have a brief overview of the basics. All right, thanks.
I'm going to take a minute here to launch the first of the CLE polls. Attorneys, you must respond to both polls in the 2-hour session to receive CLE credit. So please respond now to the first one. I will leave it up for about 2 minutes. Thank you. I'm sorry, for the presenters, please feel free to continue.
Thanks, Kelly.
So I was going to say next, yeah, go ahead, Paige.
I think next, was that going to be a demonstration?
Yes. So some of our presenters have been very, very kind to volunteer to demo the ALJ VE attorney conversation.
Okay, this is the transcript. Is that what we're referring to? Okay, so I am going to be the administrative law judge, which is as close to being a judge as I am going to get. So this will be really fantasy role playing here. Paige, I believe you're going to do the part of the attorney.
Yes.
And I'm not sure who's doing the VE.
I'm the VE, so I'll talk really fast like they do, so it'll be hard for you to catch what they're saying.
Okay, so I'll begin an examination of the vocational expert by the administrative law judge. Question, all right. I'd like to ask you a hypothetical question. Assume a person of the claimant's age, education, with the prior relevant work experience that we've already discussed, who would be limited to light exertional level. The individual would never climb ladders, ropes, or scaffolds, no more than occasional climbing of ramps or stairs, no more than occasional stooping, balancing, kneeling, crouching, or crawling. The individual should avoid concentrated exposure to extreme heat, excessive vibrations. It says extreme hold. I assume that may be extreme mold. Extreme vibrations, operational controls of moving machinery or hazardous machinery. The individual should be in a low stress job defined as having only occasional decision-making, occasional changes in the work setting, or judgments required on the job. The individual should have a job which does not require interaction with the public and only brief and superficial contact with supervisors and coworkers would be required. Given that residual capacity, function capacity, could such an individual do any past relevant work?
No, Your Honor.
Is there other work?
Yes, Your Honor. There is light work housekeeper, cleaner, night cleaner, DOT number 323-687-014. This is light work with an SVP of 2. In the Philadelphia metropolitan area, there are 9,800 jobs in that category, and nationwide 917,470 jobs. The individual could do linen grader, DOT 361-687-022. This is light work with an SVP of 2. In the Philadelphia metropolitan area, there are 4,900 jobs in that category, and nationwide 454,000. This person could do garment sorter, DOT 222-687-014. This is light work with an SVP of 2. In the Philadelphia metropolitan area, there are 1,650 jobs in that category, and nationwide 218,740 jobs. These are just examples, Your Honor.
Would there be any job available with that SVP if I added the limitation of no more than frequent bilateral use of hands for reaching, handling, fingering, feeling, pushing, or pulling?
The housekeeper, night cleaner, that will stay. That job is okay. Linen grader, I have to look for what, how is it classified with that? Yep, that will stay also. It's frequent.
The housekeeping?
The linen grader, the housekeeper, and the garment sorter.
They would all?
They will all stay, yes.
Do the jobs that you have given me in response to the hypothetical so far require that the individual do more than understand, follow, and remember simple instructions in the context of a simple, routine, repetitive, concrete, and tangible task?
No, they're SVP 2, and they go with that instruction that you gave.
And if the hypothetical calls for sedentary exertional level as opposed to light exertional level, now on this point, I do not want you to consider the manipulative limitations.
Okay.
Only the other limitations, the postural and the environmental limitations that I've given you earlier, and of course the mental limitations. If the position were sedentary, where we know he could not, if the position were sedentary, we know he could not perform any past work, but is there other work?
Yes, Your Honor. He could do table work, DOT number 739-687-182. This is sedentary work with an SVP of 2, unskilled labor. In the Philadelphia metropolitan area, there are 4,900 jobs in that category, and nationwide 471,750. This person could do toy stuffer, DOT 731-685-014. This is sedentary work with an SVP of 2, unskilled labor. In the Philadelphia metropolitan area, there are 4,470 jobs in that category, and nationwide 367,700. You want one more?
Yes, if there is.
This person could do surveillance system monitor, DOT number 379-367-010. This is sedentary work with an SVP of 2, unskilled labor. In the Philadelphia metropolitan area, there are 1,680 jobs in that category, and nationwide, 96,260.
Now, if the individual had an additional limitation at the sedentary exertional level that I've given you, that would include no more than frequent bilateral use of hands for reaching in all directions, handling, fingering, feeling, pushing, or pulling, would that eliminate the jobs that you have given?
It will not eliminate the surveillance system monitor nor the table worker. I'm checking for this one. No, you said frequent, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that will not eliminate that. The toy stuffer either.
Has the testimony you've provided today been consistent with the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, and its companion literature that you have not already explained?
Yes, Your Honor, and it's based also on my experience in this field.
All right, Counselor, do you have questions for the vocational expert?
Thank you, Your Honor. If we had a hypothetical individual working at the unskilled occupational level, what is the frequency with which they would be permitted to be absent on a monthly basis before they would lose their job?
Not more than 1.25 to 1.5 days a month. Really, there's usually 3 months probation. That's not even allowed.
Okay. If a hypothetical individual were, I'll ask you to look at B19F. Do you have that exhibit?
Yes, I can wait for that to come up.
Sure.
Why don't you just give her the limitations?
Oh, certainly, Your Honor.
So she doesn't have to interpret the document.
Absolutely. This exhibit indicates certain limitations, and I'll ask you about the impact on their ability to work. One being is listed as unable to meet competitive standards, which means notable difficulty from 21 to 40% of the workday. If that were the case for maintaining regular attendance and to be punctual within customary, usual strict tolerances, what impact would that have?
He couldn't keep a job.
Okay. The same level of limitation with sustaining an ordinary routine without special supervision.
There's some supervision, but the job of housekeeper, cleaner at night, he's pretty much on his own. There will be little check-in with him with the supervisor.
If you require special supervision to do that job?
No, you can't. You really can't. You're supposed to be on your own.
Okay. Again, notable difficulty between 21 and 40% of the workday or work week. That were the same for completing a normal workday and work week without interruptions from psychologically based symptoms.
Well, if the symptoms, psychological based symptoms, are preventing him from doing the job, people pay you to do a job because they need somebody to do the job. 20 to 40% is a lot to be off task. That's based on my experience in the field. You really cannot keep a job with that much off task.
If there was an indication of a serious limitation, as how it is defined at B17F, meaning there's a substantial loss in the ability to effectively function. If that were the case, when interacting appropriately with supervisors, an individual was said to have serious limitation, meaning substantial loss in the ability to effectively function.
Function in what way?
I'm just reading you the definition. The function would be interacting appropriately with the supervisor.
Right. So there's marked. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Marked. Interacts appropriately with supervisor, interacts appropriately with a coworker. Is that what you're reading?
Yes. Yes, I am.
Yeah, that means you're not able to get along with people you're working with, and that will ultimately end in dismissal, which we had heard happened.
Yes. The same level of impairment, the marked level of impairment for responding appropriately to usual work situations and to changes in a routine work setting
Yeah, well, these jobs that I gave you are really just routine. There's not a lot of changes. There are not hardly any changes. Once you have a job, you just do it the same?
So if the hypothetical individual were markedly limited, meaning substantial loss in the ability to effectively function in responding appropriately to usual work situations, would that be work preclusive?
Now they can't keep a job.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I don't have any other hypothetical questions. Thank you, Your Honor.
How long do you think you will be before you get the primary care doctor's records?
Very quickly. I think within a week's time.
All right. If you have difficulties, please let me know. I'll keep the record open for 7 days.
Yes, Your Honor.
And let's stop there.
I was just getting in the swing of it.
I don't want you to read the name that I forgot to redact. I redacted it in the version that'll go out.
So did anyone have any questions about that demonstration? I think Judge Allen did a tremendous job at giving like what is a very stereotypical RFC, and VE Dempsey also did a pretty amazing job answering all those detailed questions. I don't know if anyone was writing down some of the things she offered, the DOT numbers, some of the back and forth. Paige did a very nice job crossing. Does anyone have any questions about that?
I would definitely be writing down the DOT numbers. I'd be writing down the SVP numbers. I'd be writing down the skill level, so unskilled. That's usually all I have time to get, and the title as much as I can. I don't know what you guys try to write down as it's going on.
Yeah, I do the DOTs. I did a number of successful remands because the DOTs were all wrong. Or 2 of them were wrong, and I was able to knock out the other one for a reason. So I agree with Jen. It's amazing how frequently they get that wrong.
When you go after a specific job, Jen touched upon it before, sometimes it's difficult because you can knock all 3 jobs out. If long as the vocational expert is still there, the judge will change the hypothetical slightly or make some other modification, and then just ask the vocational expert for 3 more jobs. And that can go on for quite a while. I mean, sometimes it makes more sense to try to knock out all jobs through the off task or through the days absent, rather than trying to just do a situation where you're going after each individual job. You can do that, but oftentimes the judge will just come up with a different scenario and ask for 3 more jobs.
Oh yeah, I'm talking about on appeal. If you're arguing on appeal and none of the DOTs are correct,
right?
Then the judge doesn't, or the VE's not there to give any other DOT numbers.
Right.
So I agree with you when you're there. And plus, when you're there, you're probably not going to be able to get the DOT quick enough to come up to say, it's probably, practically speaking, that's pretty hard to do.
Very hard, yeah.
But you can, I agree. You want to do this after the hearing, right? You can go back, if you check the DOT numbers, if they're all bad, you can write in a letter objecting to the VE testimony wholesale if they're all wrong. And sometimes, unless the judge really hates your claimant, they'll just be like, all right, the commissioner didn't meet the burden. Some ALJs will bend over backwards and instead will, send out the case to another, like interrogatories to another vocational expert and try to get new testimony. But sometimes you can get it out that way. But I think one thing that they're both bringing up as good points is you don't always want to keep questioning the VE to get to know. Sometimes, and this is, as people do this more, you'll get better. You'll start to realize whether or not you can win this hearing or whether you're setting up issues for appeal. And it's a hard thing to tease out, but getting the ultimate answer for the VE might actually close off your avenues for appeal.
I see Sarah has a question about the special supervision question. She said her question, I have a question about the special supervision question. What sorts of evidence would you look for to support a hypothetical like that? So in this particular case, what it was just in the medical source statement. So that's where it came from. You could also have special supervision with something like a person who's done, I did a case recently where the only work she'd ever done was was a vocational rehab job where she had a job coach. So that wasn't really work anyway. But I think you could look at some jobs where you have a person sometimes is given special assistance because people feel sorry for them. So I've had people who are like nice people and then on the job their coworkers or their supervisors give them special, they explain what to do repeatedly, and then that just comes out with testimony, or you sometimes get a letter from an employer.
This is Susan Michalik. I'm sorry that you can't see me. Because of the weather, I didn't make it into my office, so I'm logging on remotely from a different office. So my video doesn't work. But if you have a younger individual, you want to look and see if they've had special ed classes. And that's when school records are going to be really important. I recently had a child's case where the kid was so bad, 7 years old, and he was not yet potty trained. So he needed constant supervision. He would go to one of his teacher's rooms and lay on a mat most of the day, every day. So if you have a younger person, look at those kinds of things as well.
There was a question, it was difficult for me to catch up writing down everything and any recommendations besides practicing. Thank you for the resource, Nick. I often, I've gotten to an age where sometimes I don't catch things the first time around. So I will ask the judge if the vocational expert can please repeat the job title and the DOT number. And I've never had a judge who's had a problem with that. And oftentimes the judge is having the same difficulty.
I would just,
Okay, if there's not, go ahead.
sorry. I would just note that Nick Fendon had put a link in the chat box, says highly recommend this resource to navigate occupations, and it's a web address for skilltran.com. So everyone can go in the chat box and check that out.
So that is an excellent resource. Thanks, Nick. Just if there are no more questions, I know each of us were going to talk about some of the general principles related to some of the more common but more advanced crosses that we're going to be discussing today in the breakouts. Just to get us started off, Susan, you were going to talk about some of the issues with transferability.
And we're talking transferability of skills. So if you have past relevant work that is unskilled, you have no skills to transfer. So keep that in mind. Many of our clients don't have skills. They have worked at unskilled jobs. I have a hypothetical coming up in which we're going to have a skilled worker, and we're going to go through some facts and some questions about that. The level of skill, who was it? I think it was Jane, perhaps, did a presentation on VE Cross and talked about skills and transferability of skills. The SVP, the specific vocational preparation time, is usually given in a code of 1 through 10, 1 and 2 being unskilled, 3, 4, 5 being semi-skilled, 6, 7, 8 up to 9, and then very skilled. So many of my cases, this is not an issue. And why I decided to do this issue is, I don't know, I'm regretting it now, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then the issue of identifying skills, because some things are not really skills, they're aptitudes. I have a good penchant for active listening. Some people do not. Is that an aptitude or is that a skill? Again, I don't deal with these specific issues a lot. And when I do, I hunker down and review the regs on skills and the transferability issues. I'm going to ask that as many people as possible. I know I can't, but would you please show yourselves? You have no idea what it looks like to see 42 or 41 now boxes. Thank you so much. Come on, a few more. Come on. Don't be afraid. We don't bite. Thank you so much. This looks so much better than black boxes. Trish Schilling, show yourself.
Okay, Susan, it's going to get to be like a gospel meeting here.
Well, we got almost half.
Susan, I'm not at home. I'm at home.
We
I
almost
don't
got to
have a
half.
camera.
Okay, so I picked on you. Okay. Yannette, I know that you are new to MidPenn and that you were on camera very early on. So let's take a look at your face. My house is a mess. Maybe next time. Okay. I love that one. Okay. So that's what we're going to talk about in my breakout session, skills and how do you figure out what is a skill and how do you figure out if it's transferable. So look forward to that.
Awesome. Thanks, Susan. I think I'm next. And thank you for getting folks to join. I share Susan's encouragement. I love seeing everyone's faces, people I know, people I don't know. So I'm Paige, and we're going to be talking in my breakout about alternating between sitting and standing. And I'm going to just share my screen to share some resources on this issue, because there's a couple of SSRs, which are Social Security rulings, which speak about them well. And I'll scroll up to the top after I read from this section because they're helpful in general on doing VE cross, so you can see the title and refer back to them. Social Security rulings are issued by the Social Security Administration to provide guidance on things that the regulations may not get into. And they're considered binding. So there's case law, at least in our district, that they're binding on the ALJ as an employee of the administration that promulgated them. So there's two that are helpful with alternating sitting and standing, or a sit-stand option. And they're pretty plain language, like most SSRs are. So at the risk of boring you, I'm going to just read from here. Alternating sitting and standing. An individual may need to alternate the required sitting of sedentary work by standing and possibly walking periodically. Where this need cannot be accommodated by scheduled breaks in a lunch period, the occupational base for a full range of unskilled sedentary work will be eroded. The extent of the erosion will depend on the facts in the case record, such as the frequency of the need to alternate sitting and standing and the length of time needed to stand. The RFC assessment must be specific as to the frequency of the individual's need to alternate sitting and standing. And it would be especially useful in these situations to consult a vocational resource to determine if the individual can make an adjustment to other work. So this SSR in general is talking about when you need a VE, and you need a VE to talk about sit-stand options because it's not addressed by the Dictionary of Occupational Title and it's not addressed by the grids. So that's SSR 96-9P, and we'll talk about what parts of this are really important that you may want to bring up at the time, or you may want to bring up later, depending on if it's a waivable issue. If you don't bring it up at the time of the hearing and you don't want to give them a chance to produce additional jobs while the VE is still there. The other SSR is 83-12. Which talks about when you really cannot use the grids or the medical vocational rules and you need a VE. And as you can see here, again, it talks about alternating sitting and standing, where the individual has to sit and then has to get up and stand or walk for a while, which is important, before returning to sitting. That individual is not functionally capable of either the prolonged sitting of sedentary work or the prolonged standing and walking for most light work. There are some jobs in the national economy typically professional and managerial ones in which a person considers stand with a degree of choice. Most jobs have ongoing work processes which demand that a worker be in a certain place or posture for at least a certain length of time to accomplish a certain task. Typically, this guidance says that typically unskilled jobs do not allow sitting or standing at will, but you'll find that most vocational experts will say that unskilled jobs do this. So what are some important things to remember here are that if you have a sit-stand option where it would be included in the hypothetical, like what Jane was doing as a judge, it has to talk about the frequency that you need to alternate sitting and standing. Do you need to alternate every 30 minutes, every hour, every 2 hours? Can it be accommodated by normal breaks? And you keep seeing a reference here to walking. We have a lot of clients who, you know, when they're talking about unskilled work where you're sitting or standing, they're envisioning like a conveyor belt where you have a stool where you can sit or stand, but you're still at a workstation performing the job duties. Our clients talk about sitting or standing, and they're not really just standing in one place. They're walking around, they're stretching, they're reclining. So these are some important things that you want to pull out anytime you hear a judge start talking about a sit-stand option, because they're trying to, you know, fit the claimant into sedentary work and light work and find more jobs. And so you want to be able to pick that apart. And it's a common way that we would try to talk about having less than sedentary work, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So my hypothetical is going to discuss someone who needs to alternate between sitting and standing, and what does the judge need to do to comply with these regulations. Does anyone have any questions about sitting in the sit-stand option before I move on? I guess I don't know if there's any questions on that specifically in the chat. I'm taking a look now, but
There aren't any questions.
okay, thanks, Kelly.
Sure.
So am I next or are you, Jen?
Go right ahead.
Okay, so I'll go through this fairly quickly because I know we want to allow you to have time to practice. So some of the issues that in my hypothetical are that full-time work requires the ability to work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, or an equivalent schedule. That's an SSR 96-8P. So the reason that makes a difference is you sometimes, and actually surprisingly often, have a medical opinion evidence indicating that the person can walk, sit, and stand a total of less than 8 hours. So if they can't do that for a total of 8 hours, then they can't do full-time work, because you have to be able, you're either sitting or standing or walking. If you can't, if the total is less than that, it's not full-time work. The full range of sedentary requires the ability to lift up to 10 pounds and to stand and walk occasionally. And as was referenced before, occasionally means up to 1/3 of the time, which is no more than 2 hours. If you can get your client on the grid because they're older and they're limited to sedentary or light, then you're good. If you have a younger person, just being sedentary isn't going to help much. You need to get them at less than sedentary. So not even less than sedentary, still you're going to need to have enough limitations that prevents work in the national economy. But you want to be sure that you're getting people who are younger at less than sedentary for whatever reason. The complete inability to stoop, which I would demonstrate, which I had a big argument with a judge one time about what this means. The ability to stoop is, to most people, when they hear the word stoop, they think crouch. They think like do like when you're doing yoga and you go down and then you're going to do the crow, but that's not what it is. It's just bending at the waist. So not being able to bend at the waist significantly erodes the vocational base available for somebody who's limited to unskilled sedentary work. Because of a lot of unskilled sedentary work, it's like, okay, I sit at a production thing and I lean over and I do something and I lean back. Well, if I can't lean over and lean back or lean down, you know, and do something, then I can't do that work. So if you're limited to unskilled sedentary work, and you can't stoop, and we have a lot of clients who have issues with their back that certainly prevent it on an occasional basis, which is, you know, 2 hours a day, then you knock out the work. The other issue, and we've already talked about SVP, The SVP of 1 or 2 is considered to be unskilled work. And that's an important factor that you might want to try to include in your own hypotheticals. The judges often talk about SVPs, and as you heard, vocational experts will identify SVPs when they're talking about jobs. The other thing that we haven't talked too much about is where did the numbers come from? So that's certainly something you can, Jane talked about that a little bit in her training. When you have a vocational expert say there's 9,000 jobs, there's 10,000 jobs, there's 450,000 jobs, where does that come from? What is the basis of that? Perfectly legitimate question, a question you can ask. Also, if you're talking about a job, the DOT, you know, a lot of times the date last updated is 1977. Ask the vocational expert, has there been a change in this job since 1977? Like Jen said, you know, we don't use microfiche anymore. We don't, clerk typists don't really exist in the world either in the way that the DOT envisions them. So that's a question you can ask too. So that's all. I know we need to move along.
Okay, my hypothetical gets to some of the non-exertional issues, specifically concentration, persistence, and pace, but there are actually others that I'd like to address. My hypothetical deals with a person who is highly educated, but something happens to them, and what are the ramifications of their now diminished abilities intellectually and when it comes to concentration and those issues. And I'd like to also discuss and throw in some things about medical source statements and how that can affect your cross-examination, and also issue spotting as far as RFC for exertional. When you have a case that's primarily non-exertional, how to throw in some of those exertional limitations. And if it's a younger individual, as Rebecca said, you're going to have to show that they're below sedentary, and how do we erode that RFC to the point where it becomes less than sedentary. And we're looking mostly, when we're talking non-exertional, we're talking about time off task, days absent, the inability to keep up a persistent pace, those sort of things. And those are the things that I'll be addressing and looking to have people formulate questions about.
And then my breakout session will be dealing with things very related to Jane's, and I think both of our hypos deal a lot with questions that you're going to want to think about for younger claimants, because you are trying to get people, less than sedentary. And physically, if you can't do that, which is harder for younger claimants, you're going to be trying to establish that they do not have the interpersonal skills, the concentration skills, the kind of mental fortitude to do even basic work. And so one of the ways you do that is, really attacking their ability to concentrate and complete tasks, which you have to do at work. And the other way, which I'm going to be addressing, is they need to be able to interact in a way that, the Social Security rulings put it a whole bunch of different ways, but, without excess irritability and paranoia, and they're going to have to be able to respond in a way that's routine and consistent. And basically, they can't be snapping out at their clients or supervisors all the time, right? So the hypothetical I'm addressing is, a lot of times when you have a claimant who has a lot of behavioral health issues or is talking a lot about fighting and anxiety, the judges will try to deal with that by limiting the amount of time that they have to be supervised and interact with their supervisors. They'll just work independently. It's fine. We don't have to worry about them getting mad at people because they're going to be off in their own bubble. And limiting how much work they have to do with coworkers. Sometimes they say they don't have to work with coworkers. They'll just be working parallel. But the reality is most workplaces require you to interact with your coworkers and supervisors. So we're going to talk through some of those issues and also give you some sample questions you can think about how to get at that and get the VE to talk about that, because that's something that's also not really addressed by the DOT. But since many vocational experts do help place people, they are familiar with the fact that if you yell at your supervisor every week or so, you're going to get fired, right? So at this point, Kelly, I think we are ready to do our first round of breakouts. And just so everyone knows, our plan is to do 2 20-minute breakouts. So you will not be doing all 5 of these hypotheticals. You'll be participating in 2, but we already sent out all the hypothetical questions with some questions that you can think about. And I know all of us would be happy if you have questions that aren't addressed in your groups to deal with those after the training.
And just bear with me for a moment while the groups are created and they split off, and the presenters, it may take an extra moment or 2 to get you all in separate groups if it doesn't work out, but I'll be on it and it will get done. So bear with me, everyone, just for a few seconds.
Oh, we're back.
Right. But I don't see everyone else back. Did anybody have any questions while we're back, but waiting to be broken out again?
I have a question. Have you ever asked a VE if they have ever personally observed that job being performed?
I don't know that I've ever asked them if they've ever personally
Work
observed it, but I
for
have
people
asked
who are
them
younger.
where the information came from. Like, you say that this job doesn't require bending, or you say that this job doesn't require, how do you know that? And they may say, because I place people in jobs and I've seen that. They may say, I have a source that gives me information about that. But that's a very good question. Like, well, where does that come from? How do you know that they don't have to bend? They don't have to stoop?
Well, I was thinking of what you said with the nut sorter. I mean, it's a big difference if the job is being performed by a machine and someone is watching the machine than if they're actually sitting at a table bending and reaching. So
right. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
How's the job performed, right? And how do you know how the job is performed?
Right.
Like, does that come from ONET, which is what everybody else in the world uses now from Department of Labor? Does that come, did you just read the DOT description? Like, where does that come from? And then once they tell you where it comes from, then you can say, can you give me that? Where is that source? Can you show me that source? So great.
We use nut sorter in our discussion too.
Oh, did you?
We
It's
use
a great job to talk about.
dental floss
Or potato chip sorter.
packer.
Okay.
Hi again,
I think
everybody.
we're back.
So that was great. If anyone from my session has any more questions, please feel free to reach out to me.
Same here.
Well,
My email's at the top of my example.
So are we going right into the second breakout, presenters?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just need to switch the presenters to different groups. So just give me a moment and we'll get you in your groups again.
Oh.
While everybody's joining us, did anybody have questions from our breakout? We're going to have a short wrap up. Paige is going to do a short wrap up here once everybody joins us again.
Oh my gosh, that goes so fast.
I was so panicked trying to get that out before the clock ran out.
This is Kelly. While everybody's coming back, I'm going to launch the second of the CLE polls. Attorneys, please respond so that I can record your participation. And I will leave that up for about 2 minutes.
Awesome.
And then Presenters, please feel free to go on with any questions or responses or dialogue that you need to have.
Before we do that, Kelly, I don't know about the other presenters, but I am not able to respond to the poll.
No,
I don't
we
think we
have
have
to.
to.
Co-hosts don't need to and aren't able.
Okay.
You can just click off of it and it'll disappear.
Okay,
Sorry about that, Susan.
that's okay.
Hopefully it's assumed that we're participating.
Right, since we're talking, you would hope that that would follow from the fact that we're talking.
Okay.
Well, I think it got easier to do the breakouts in the second session than the first. I apologize to the people in the first session. The second one, I think, went much, you identify the things much more quickly. So I appreciate the patience of the people in the first group.
Yeah, I had a similar experience, although I was trying to, my participants were rushing to pick questions and I put them on the spot, but everyone did great.
Agreed.
Thank you everyone for your participation.
Especially in this weird way of participating. This is a weird way to do it.
It's so unnatural.
Right.
So, and I apologize for the cat meowing in the background if you guys can hear it, but
Is there Jen? Hey, so there's this woman named Janae.
So I wanted to bring everybody back and we wanted to bring everybody back and give you an opportunity if you had more questions about anything to pop it in the chat box. We've only got, 3 or 4 minutes left. But this would be the time about any of the segments to ask us any questions. Just to go over kind of some of the overview of what Jen talked about. There's like 3 parts to the vocational expert questioning. The first is from the ALJ. The ALJ will go, then you ask your magic questions if the ALJ hasn't. Those magic questions being, is your testimony limited to the specific questions stated by the ALJ? Absence, if someone was going to be absent more than 3 days per month, would there be any jobs? And then the off task question, which is if someone would be off task 20% of the day, or in some places it's 15%, would there be any jobs? So you always want to ask those. And then you get into the more specific, either competing hypotheticals that you pose to the vocational expert, or cross-examining the vocational expert on the hypotheticals that the ALJ provided, which are more specific to your case. So I was trying to just babble a little bit to give folks time to put their questions in the chat if they have them. And I don't necessarily see any. So is there anything else my co-presenters wanted to add?
Paige, I would just say, this is Kelly. I think everybody from the breakout sessions pretty much is unmuted. If you're not right now, you can unmute yourself. So if you don't want to type out a question or comment, please just go ahead and make sure you're unmuted and then go ahead and speak it out.
I think everybody just wants to get off this thing.
I choose to think that the presenters did such a fantastic job that there's no need for any questions.
Beg to differ.
Okay, presenters, do you have anything else?
No, just like to thank everybody for their attention and their comments and feedback. It certainly makes it go much quicker and more relevant.
If you have any questions, once you look at materials that you may not have now, feel free to get to contact one of us, because we'll send you, we're going to send you the whole transcript of the hearing. If you read it and think, oh wait, I don't understand what happened there or whatever. And that applies to all the sessions, honestly. If you read through the materials and have questions, feel free to contact somebody.
We do have a question here in the chat box. How many hearings do you do monthly and yearly?
That varies an awful lot depending on the time of year. And I mean, I can do some months do 5 or 6, some months do 1, maybe 2. It really varies.
And I would say much less during COVID.
Yes.
Yep, much less
Me
lately.
too. So I used to try to keep it to 6, but sometimes up to 10, but now maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah, I have
Back in the
clients
old
in a
days,
holding, I'm sorry, go ahead.
back in the old days, I used to have to drive from Mifflin County to the west part of Clearfield County to a little town called DuBois. And I would have 5 hearings a day. And that would be usually once or twice a month. Now that is nowhere near that. This was back in the 90s.
We do have another question for the presenters. How long is a typical VE direct?
I'd say at least a couple of minutes, up to 10 minutes.
We didn't even do the full VE direct from the transcript because they often will go into the past relevant work first. So in our demonstration, it would have been about twice as long, I'd guess.
Right. It really depends on the ALJ, how many how many and how complex the hypotheticals are. And of course, the number of hypotheticals you ask has to do with how long it takes you to get to know jobs. But the hearing itself is only an hour. So the VE questioning is only going to be 10, 15 minutes. It's not going to be half an hour like you might, like those of you who have Court of Common Pleas experience, it's not going to be like that. It's not going to be where you spend an hour or so cross-examining somebody.
Okay, well, there's no more questions. So presenters, thank you so much for giving of your time and information to share this with everybody. Thanks everybody for attending and participating. Take care if you're in a snowy, icy area like most of us are today, and have a great rest of the day.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye-bye.